Darcy remains something of an enigma even as we head deeper into the heart of Amphibia's last season. We know that she still remains something like Marcy. She still retains some characteristics of Marcy's. She still has Marcy's cunning and her strategic intellect, even though she appears to lack Marcy's tenderness and her regard for others, as well as her timid awkwardness. But though we have a clear idea of just how much of Marcy's diamond-sharp mind she inherits, we don't quite know a lot about her own individual personality and identity, or if she can even be said to have an identity outside Marcy's, although she certainly is not just Marcy, and she's certainly not just the core either. That Marcy's story is tragic, both in the colloquial sense of that term and in the heightened Shakespearean sense, is correct, and I made a video I'm quite proud of back around the time True Colors aired called The Tragedy of Marcy, in which I compare Marcy to the central tragic figures in quite a few Shakespearean dramas to try and tease out some common characteristics between these characters. Perhaps more controversially, I would argue that Darcy is also tragic. Now, I'm not saying that Darcy is altogether a good being or phenomenon, and I believe, of course, that Marcy needs to be freed from the influence of the core. That moment when her consciousness was fused with the core in Olivia and Yunnan was spine-chilling. But it is not necessarily the case that every element of the core is more villainous than Andreas, whose true form, absent the pretenses he adopts, seems to be one of the campy and melodramatic and rather mocking villains that Disney used to turn out quite often in the 90s and late 80s during the Renaissance. Think films like The Little Mermaid or The Lion King. Think Ursula or Scar. Before Disney decided in this new, modern, post-Frozen era that a central big bad no longer should be the focus of their movies. You would be hard-pressed to find a straightforward, obvious villain in a modern Disney movie. But here in the Disney TV shows, you do have Andreas, who fits that descriptor quite well. But Darcy is a little different. One cannot draw a sharp division between Marcy and the core. Their essences have become innately blended together. It is not as though there is one half that is Marcy and one half that is the core. Darcy kind of blends these two minds, these two essences, these two identities together. And of course, the core itself is comprised of many different identities and many different minds, not all of whom probably share the same ideals and values. So it is difficult to make a singular judgment on who Darcy is or how we should feel about her. This innate blending was a major reason why Andreas could not have just picked a random newt to be the vessel for the core. He is the king, so he has the authority to order one of the newts to serve him in such an extreme regard, and he is so authoritarian and iron-fisted that he would not hesitate to force the newt of his choice into such a position, even if the newt was terrified. But Andreas doesn't do that because the host matters. Because it is not simply Marcy's body being controlled by the host, by the core, it's these two distinct beings kind of being fused and mixed together. He chose Marcy because she's smart, because she's cunning, because she's ambitious. She has big plans, and the drive to achieve those plans. These traits have not disappeared now that the core has merged and fused with Marcy. In fact, those traits can be more clearly seen now because they are no longer swamped by Marcy's softer and gentler tendencies. They are no longer there to blunt the elemental power and force of her strategic side. This transformation is, of course, not good, but it is not something we should wholly dismiss as entirely bad either. Marcy was never arrogant or self-centered, despite her intellect and despite the reverence that others have for her intellectual might, especially in Utopia, because she stays grounded. She still cares a lot what other people think, and she wants them to think well of her, and she wants them to prosper in their own lives. When Anne needs her help, Marcy does not hesitate to help her, even when what Anne wants is difficult, to the extent that Marcy is dedicated to helping Anne and understanding Anne and really trying to get into Anne's head and know what she wants for herself. This is demonstrated in the episode A Day at the Aquarium, wherein Anne is unable to recognize that Marcy wants to stay with her, that Marcy wants to be with Anne, that she doesn't want Anne to just run off with the planters, not because of any practical reasons, but because she cares about her friend and doesn't want to say goodbye to her. Anne is completely oblivious to this, and yet Marcy does not object. Marcy is still dedicated to helping Anne, and this dedication is admirable to a certain extent, but when taken too far, this selflessness can turn into a sort of self-abasement, an unwillingness to consider her own needs and ideals and perspectives, an unwillingness to exert herself because she's so afraid of being rejected. She's so afraid of upsetting others that she's afraid to really stand up for her own beliefs or her own personal wants. Well, she lacks Anne's natural sociability or Sasha's explosive charisma. Now, it is possible for Marcy to become more comfortable in social situations. Just compare how at ease she feels in Utopia to how tense she always was back on Earth, and how not just introverted, but very embarrassed and almost ashamed she was when she was with others. This change really demonstrates that Marcy's problem is not with social situations per se, but with her own bashfulness and her own unwillingness to exert herself and her own beliefs because of how she's afraid of how others will respond. And even after she grows so much in Amphibia, we see these timid tendencies return when she's with Sasha and Anne, and arguably for good reason, because she is afraid of upsetting Anne or Sasha, because she knows what she did to them, getting them trapped in this world, and she does not want them to be angry with her. Ironically, this conflict-averse, bashful approach does not help Marcy long-term. She subordinates her own desires and her own will, and just kind of goes along with what other people want, and it does not benefit her, because they find out the truth eventually, and they're furious, not just at what she did, but because she didn't tell them. If Marcy had just been more honest with what had happened and why she did what she did, they might not have forgiven her necessarily, at least not right away, but they would have understood her motives and her perspective, and they would have been able to at least endeavor to heal their friendship in an open and healthy way. Thus, Marcy's timidity and her unwillingness to engage in social interactions wherein there's a possibility that others might be a little upset or offended at what she has to say is not a strength. There are drawbacks to being too conflict averse and too selfless and too unwilling to think about what's best for one's own self. If Marcy had a little more of the nonchalant confidence that possesses the core, she would probably be better off. So, perhaps Marcy, when all of this is over, is able to maintain that sense of sturdy, unfading confidence, that willingness to just be decisive and say what she really thinks. Which is better for not just her, but that entire friend group. As for the core, I do wonder if there are some elements in the core that will be more sympathetic toward Marcy. As I mentioned before, not every voice in the core probably has the same perspective. Probably not all of them are allied with Andreas. It would be quite strange if they were all on his side, if we are to take Andreas at face value when he says that the core is an accumulation of all the greatest minds in Amphibia. Great minds do not, despite what the axiom says, think alike. They differ on a lot of varying respects. I'm imagining this plane of the mind, this empty, ethereal white plane where all these figures congregate, and I imagine some of them who are more sympathetic to Marcy kind of visiting her on that plane inside the mind space of the core and trying to talk to her. And think about that for a second. If the core is not a singular entity, which we are given ample reason to believe it's not, and if some of the minds in it are on Marcy's side, which stands reason to believe that they are, then the core is as tragic as Marcy. And thus Darcy is tragic, forced to embark on paths and serve ideals that Darcy, as an accumulation of all these different minds and perspectives, has to be at least a bit ambiguous about, has to be at least a little uncertain about. That's a really interesting dynamic, and I'm glad the show has set that up. So anyway, thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can and you want to see more videos like this. Keep watching Amphibia. It does strange that the show is going to be ending soon. It's been a pleasure and an honor to be making these videos for y'all throughout this past year. And when the show is over, I hope y'all stick around and look at the other videos I still have on this channel. Anyway, tune in soon for my next analysis. It will be coming soon. Thank y'all again. Really. Adios, comrades.